intelligence stopped there. But when I was in 3rd grade, I was pretty smart. You'll never guess which word I had to spell. In order to win the spelling bee. It was not terrorist. They didn't teach us that in 3rd grade. All right. It was the word remember. All right. You guys are all thinking it's like something crazy, like, that's gonna be an awesome word, like fart. All right, so totally wasn't that. All right. Is that with an H or without the H? F-A-H-R. Okay. Anyways, all right. Anyways, subtle cut, subtle dig. Not very funny though, was it? All right, so I remember. I'll bring you Chick-fil-A again sometime soon. All right. So remember, I remember standing there in front of the entire, student body and stuff, and we're doing our, spelling bee, and I remember the girl next to me, and she had just totally floundered some word, and so I came up there and I was like, and they said, you need to spell the word remember. I said, remember. They didn't back then like they used to, like whatever it was and like the origin, I didn't ask you, what's the origin of that word, so. I told you it stopped in 3rd grade, all right? Leave me alone. So I said, remember. R-E-M-E-M-B-E-R. Remember, man. So I won the spelling bee. What did they give me? A trophy. They gave me a trophy. It was like a cool little trophy. And it just said spelling bee champion. I was like, man, this is cool. And so I sat that on my mantle for a long time because I didn't have any sports trophies then. So I sat that on my mantle, and I was the spelling bee champion in 3rd grade at Baker Elementary School in Atlanta, Georgia. Yeah, really cool. I'll never forget it. And that trophy was a symbol of that. You've also got trophies in sports. You've got the hockey trophies at the Larry O'Brien's. Is that what it is? No, that's the basketball one. What is it called? The Stanley Cup. Thank you. All right. So you got the Stanley Cup, Lord Stanley. You got the Stanley Cup. What do they do? Don't they inscribe all the winners of the Stanley Cup on there? Thanks, Travis. All right. So they inscribe. So what do? It's so that they can remember what happened that year, the champion who won the NHL Stanley Cup that year. They do this so they can remember. There are lots of things that in our society are put in place so that we remember things. They're symbols. And in Israel's history, Israel had a very difficult time remembering things. They had an incredibly difficult time remembering things. And it had just driven God absolutely nuts. It just had driven God absolutely nuts. And I don't think Israel's too far removed from how you and I operate today. Because the biggest thing about Israel was this, is the less they remembered about God and what He had done for them, the more likely they were to repeat the history that got them to that point where they were either taken over by another country, where they were in pain, or they were in a deep valley. The more they forgot about God's provision, the more they found themselves repeating their own history. What history? Go look Genesis through Joshua. We're going to camp out here in Joshua chapter 4 in a second. If you look from Genesis through Joshua, you find the Israelites were always at this point. The Israelites, God placed them up on a pedestal per se. So, the Israelites, they're up here on this pedestal. They're kind of, God has placed them up here, not just because it's just Israel, not just because they were really cool people, not just because, whatever reason. It was because God had a purpose for them. God had a specific purpose for Israel, and that was to show God to every other nation through everything that they did. So God elevated them up there. It said they were God's chosen people. Chosen to do what? Chosen to reveal God to all the other nations. That doesn't mean that only Israel could be saved. That just meant that Israel was God's choice to reveal salvation to everyone else. So, Israel's put up here on this pedestal, and they're up there, and all of a sudden they get comfortable. All of a sudden they're so comfortable that they kind of forget about their loyalty to God. So in the midst of their loyalty to God, or their lack thereof, and in the midst of their comfortability, all of a sudden they begin to spend less and less time worshiping God, less and less time thinking about God. Other things begin to come up into this place of theirs. onto this pedestal along with them and above the pedestal that God was supposed to be on. So you've got things like the lust of the flesh is what the Bible calls it. So things that they desired as a body, maybe that their body desired, that they desired as a group of people, things they began to value more than they valued God, they began to look to those before they would look to God. And so where they were on their pedestal before this, they began to sink lower and lower on that pedestal that God gave them. Why? Because the purpose of them being up here was for them to be basically a city that was set up on a hill, a nightlight. And if they aren't being a nightlight, and if you're not being something God can show off, then God's going to pull you down so you don't make a mockery of who He is. God's not just going to let you stay up here in this realm where you're popular, where you're on the top shelf, where you're the top dog, where you've got status, and you've got fame, and you've got all this stuff around you. It's great and awesome. God places you there so that His name can be made great, so that you guys will recognize Him. But if you're not doing that, do you think God's just going to keep you up here on this pedestal and protect you and keep giving you stuff? And so Israel began to sink into their own demise. They began to sink and sink and sink to the point where God sent in His judgment other nations, pagan nations, nations who didn't care about God, nations who didn't care about God. The only way they used the word God was to curse or to say something vile against somebody or to mock. God sent other civilizations to come and overtake Israel, His chosen people. His chosen people. To the point where Israel was at its lowest point because they had forsaken God and they had paid more attention to their own stuff. And they basically told God they could live without Him. This ought to start sounding familiar. So then, Israel realizes that, wow, life without God really bites. It's a bad place to be when you're without God. We don't like being slaves to other nations when God has called us to be above the fray. So, what did they do? They repented. They repented. They promised God they would never dive back into that sin again. They promised God that they would never worship other idols again. They repented. They turned their eyes away from stuff and onto God. And then what did God do? God began to elevate them again back to a place where they could be a city on a hill, where they could be that nightlight. And then 40 years later, a generation goes by. And what happens? They're on the hill. They forsake God. God brings them down. He crushes the pride of the proud. And He uplifts the humble. And when they were prideful, God crushed their spirit, brought them down to the point where they would repent again. Because what's God's number one goal? For you to worship Him and for you to lead others people to Him. Israel kept repeating its own history. And these very same people remember the pain. They remember the pain and the agony from their sins. They remember the guilt that they felt from turning their eyes to other things. They remembered all that. The loneliness they felt. And yet they still turned away. And went to God. And went to other people. Went to other things besides God. And then they would repent. When we forget about what God has done for us, we repeat our own history. And we find ourselves back in that place where we are miserable, lonely, guilty. We feel guilty, in pain, and in agony because of our own sin, because of our own stuff. And so what did God do for the Israelites? What did God do for them? First off, back, let's say back in Exodus, what did God promise the Israelites? What did He promise them? Giving you half the answer in the word I just asked. Hey, the promised land. Okay, good. All right, God promised them the promised land. What was so cool about the promised land? Milk and honey. Hello, who doesn't like that? All right, land flowing milk and honey. All right, whatever that meant. All right, this meant the land was going to be fruitful. productive. It's the Middle East. What are there out there? Sand. All right? There's sand. There's dirt. There's like one palm tree, mirage. There's a lake. You go to dive in.